The morning sun cast long shadows across Westfield University's ancient buildings as Imani Jackson made her way through the main entrance. The weight of her backpack pulled at her shoulders, filled with second-hand textbooks she'd spent the summer hunting down to save money. All around her, students arrived in expensive cars, wearing designer clothes that probably cost more than her entire scholarship stipend for the month. Imani took a deep breath, her hand tightening around the acceptance letter she still carried everywhere. A habit she couldn't shake, as if the paper might disappear if she didn't keep it close. The daughter of a hard-working nurse from South Chicago, Imani had grown up watching her mother pull double shifts to keep food on the table after her father passed away when she was just 7. "You don't belong here," whispered a voice in her head that sounded suspiciously like a high school counselor who had suggested community college might be more her speed, despite her perfect SAT scores and 4.0 GPA. Imani straightened her shoulders and kept walking. The campus seemed designed to intimidate, with its ivy-covered walls and statues of long-dead wealthy donors. Students gathered in tight groups, laughing and catching up after summer break. No one made eye contact with Imani as she consulted her campus map, trying to find her way to the mathematics building. "Lost?" asked a voice. Imani looked up to see an older student watching her with an amused expression. "I'm looking for Thorn Hall," Imani answered, determined to keep her voice steady. "Fresh meat for Professor Harrington, huh?" The student pointed to a building across the quad. "Good luck. He eats scholarship kids for breakfast." Imani thanked her and walked away quickly, ignoring the knot in her stomach. She'd heard about Professor Edmund Harrington even before arriving. His textbooks were required reading in advanced calculus courses nationwide, and rumors about his treatment of students he deemed unworthy circulated widely online. The lecture hall was enormous, with tiered seating that reminded Imani of a theater. She chose a seat near the back, arranging her notebooks and pens with methodical precision. As the room filled, she noticed the empty seats on either side of her remained vacant, even as students began doubling up elsewhere. Professor Harrington entered exactly on time, his tall figure commanding immediate silence. His eyes scanned the room as he began taking attendance, calling each name without looking up from his list. When he reached Jackson Imani, his eyes lifted, scanning the room until they found her. "Ah, our scholarship recipient," he said, his tone making the achievement sound like a failing. A few students turned to look at her with curiosity or thinly disguised judgment. "I look forward to seeing if the admissions office has maintained its standards this year." Heat rushed to Imani's face, but she kept her expression neutral. This wasn't the first time someone had implied she didn't earn her spot, and it wouldn't be the last. As Harrington launched into his lecture, Imani lost herself in the familiar comfort of mathematics. Numbers had been her refuge since childhood. They didn't care where you came from or what you looked like. When Harrington wrote a complex equation on the board and asked if anyone could identify the principle behind it, Imani knew the answer immediately. Her hand twitched but stayed down. Something told her that drawing attention to herself would be a mistake. Later, as students filed out, Imani overheard two teaching assistants talking. "Harrington's on the warpath this semester," one said. "Did you hear what he said at the faculty meeting? Something about maintaining the purity of the department and weeding out those who don't have the mathematical mind." "Yeah, he and Professor Wells are planning some kind of special assessment. Poor kids don't even know what's coming." Imani clutched her notebook tighter. Back in her tiny dorm room, she had no roommate after the originally assigned girl had requested a transfer before even meeting her. Imani opened her laptop. She pulled up a folder labeled Personal Research and clicked on a document filled with complex calculations she'd been working on since high school. What Professor Harrington didn't know was that mathematics wasn't just Imani's best subject. It was her life's passion, her sanctuary, and the language she understood better than any other. If a storm was coming, she would be ready. 3 weeks into the semester, Professor Harrington sat in his wood-paneled office, staring at the first set of homework assignments from his advanced calculus class. He tapped his pen against a paper with the name Imani Jackson written neatly at the top. The work was flawless, every problem solved with elegant precision. His frown deepened as he flipped through the pages again. "This isn't right," he muttered to himself. Years of teaching had convinced him that he could spot a student who didn't belong at Westfield, and everything about Imani Jackson, from her public school background to her scholarship status, told him she shouldn't be able to produce work of this caliber. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Professor Victoria Wells entered without waiting for a response, her pearls clicking softly against the buttons of her blazer. "Edmund, are we still on for coffee?" she asked, noticing the papers spread across his desk. "Grading the first years? Any promising minds?" Harrington pushed Imani's homework aside. "Most are what we expected. The legacy students show adequate preparation. A few international students seem promising." He hesitated before adding, "There's one scholarship case that concerns me." Wells raised an eyebrow. "The Jackson girl? I saw her file during the admissions meeting. Perfect scores, but from that high school in Chicago. Highly suspicious if you ask me." "My thoughts exactly," Harrington said, leaning back in his chair. "Her work is too perfect. Either she's getting help or the admissions office has truly lowered their standards this year," Wells finished for him. "You know how the board has been pushing the diversity agenda lately." The two professors walked across campus to the faculty lounge, their conversation continuing in hushed tones. The crisp ordonnance carried their words away before any passing students could hear their plans. Inside the warmth of the lounge, they found several other professors already gathered around the fireplace. Dr. Chen from computer science nodded at them, while Dr. Patel from physics barely looked up from his journal. "We were just discussing the quality of students this year," said Dr. Foster, an elderly economics professor who had been at Westfield longer than anyone else. "Mixed bag as usual?" "Worse than usual, I fear," Harrington replied, settling into his favorite armchair. "The scholarship program is bringing in students who simply aren't prepared for Westfield's rigorous standards." "Perhaps they need more support," suggested Dr. Chen mildly. "Different backgrounds bring different strengths." Harrington waved away the comment. "What they need is to recognize when they're out of their depth. Take this Jackson girl in my class. Perfect homework, but she barely speaks in lectures. Clearly, something isn't adding up." Wells nodded in agreement. "It's cruel, really, setting these students up for failure by admitting them to a program they can't possibly handle." "What do you propose?" asked Dr. Foster, his eyes suddenly sharp with interest. Harrington leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the empty tables around them. "A special assessment. Something to demonstrate once and for all who belongs here and who doesn't." "Public?" asked Wells, a small smile playing at her lips. "Of course," said Harrington. "The lesson will benefit everyone." Later that afternoon, the two professors met in Harrington's office again. On his blackboard, they began crafting a problem, one that looked deceptively simple at first glance, but contained layers of complexity that had stumped mathematicians for decades. "The Keller-Thompson paradox," Wells said with admiration as Harrington wrote the final symbols. "Beautiful choice. I studied under Thompson briefly," she admitted, even she couldn't fully resolve it. "No first-year student could possibly tackle this," Harrington agreed, stepping back to admire their handiwork. "Especially not one from a public school with limited resources." They spent the next hour planning the details of their special assessment. They would call Imani to the front of the class, present her with the problem, and watch as she struggled, proof to everyone that she didn't belong at Westfield. Monday's lecture would be perfect, Wells suggested. "I can bring some colleagues from other departments, more witnesses to the educational moment." As darkness fell across campus, lights glowed warmly in dormitory windows. In her small single room, Imani sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by textbooks and notes. Unaware of what awaited her, she worked through problem after problem, finding peace in the certainty of mathematics while the professors plummeted her public humiliation. Monday morning arrived with dark clouds hanging over Westfield's campus, matching Imani's mood as she hurried toward the mathematics building. She had stayed up late finishing an extra credit assignment, hoping it might finally earn her Professor Harrington's approval. Rain began to fall as she entered Thorn Hall, shaking droplets from her jacket before heading to class. Imani arrived 20 minutes early as usual. The lecture hall was empty except for a janitor wiping down the chalkboards. She chose her regular seat in the back row and arranged her materials meticulously, notebooks centered on the desk, two sharpened pencils, blue pen for headings, and black for notes. Her system had served her well through years of schooling, creating order in a world that often felt chaotic. As she reviewed her notes from the previous class, other students began trickling in. The usual pattern emerged. The seats beside her remained empty while clusters formed elsewhere in the room. Imani had grown used to this invisible barrier, though it still stung. Back home, her friends had warned her about places like Westfield, but she had convinced herself that excellence would overcome prejudice. 3 weeks in, the evidence suggested otherwise. At precisely 5 minutes before class, something unusual happened. Professor Wells entered through the side door, followed by 3 other faculty members Imani recognized from around campus. They spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing toward the students. A ripple of confusion spread through the room. Professor Harrington never invited guests to his lectures. "What's going on?" whispered a boy named Tyler to his friend in the row ahead of Imani. "Is this some kind of inspection?" His friend shrugged. "Maybe Harrington's up for department chair again, showing off for the committee." The murmuring stopped abruptly when Professor Harrington strode in through the main doors, his leather briefcase swinging at his side. Instead of heading straight to the podium as usual, he conferred briefly with the other professors, nodding as they pointed to something in a folder. "Good morning," he finally announced, surveying the room with unusual intensity. "Before we continue with our exploration of multivariate calculus, I'd like to try something different today." The silence in the room deepened. Harrington never deviated from his carefully planned lectures. University education isn't merely about absorbing information, he continued, pacing slowly across the front of the room. It's about demonstrating one's capacity for original thought under pressure, something that distinguishes those truly suited for Westfield from those who perhaps found their way here through other means. Several students shifted uncomfortably. Imani felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside. "I've selected a student at random for a special assessment," Harrington said, though his eyes moved directly to where Imani sat. "Miss Jackson, would you please come to the board?" The room went completely still. Imani sat frozen, her hand clenched around her pen. This wasn't random. Nothing about this was random. "Miss Jackson, we're waiting." Taking a deep breath, Imani stood, conscious of every eye following her movement. Her legs felt wooden as she made her way down the steps to the front of the lecture hall. Professor Wells smiled thinly as she passed, while the other faculty members studied her with undisguised curiosity. "Let's see what our scholarship student is truly capable of," Harrington said, loud enough for everyone to hear the emphasis on scholarship. He turned to the board and began writing an equation that spread across its entire width. Imani watched each symbol appear with growing amazement. This wasn't from their textbook. This wasn't even from the graduate-level resources she'd been studying in her spare time. The structure was familiar, though, tickling at the edges of her memory. One of the graduate teaching assistants in the front row let out a small gasp as Harrington wrote the final terms. Another whispered something to his neighbor, who looked at Imani with a mixture of pity and disbelief. "This is the Keller-Thompson paradox," Harrington announced, stepping back from his work. "A rather famous problem in advanced calculus that has challenged mathematicians for some time." He held out a piece of chalk to Imani. "Please show us your approach to solving it." The chalk felt heavy in Imani's hand as she turned to face the board. Behind her, she could hear Professor Wells whisper to another faculty member, "This shouldn't take long." Poor girl probably doesn't even recognize what she's looking at. But Imani did recognize it. And as the first shock faded, a strange calm settled over her. She knew this problem better than anyone in the room could possibly imagine. Imani stared at the equation sprawling across the board, her heart pounding. The Keller-Thompson paradox. 3 years earlier, during her sophomore year of high school, she had stumbled across an article about it in an old mathematics journal in the public library. Something about the problem had captivated her, the elegant structure hiding impossible complexity. She had spent weeks working through it before gathering the courage to email Dr. Eleanor Thompson herself. What had started as a single question had turned into a 3-year correspondence that nobody at Westfield knew about. Not her mother, not her high school teachers, and certainly not Professor Harrington, who now stood watching her with thinly disguised satisfaction, clearly expecting her to fail. A memory flashed through Imani's mind, Sitting at her kitchen table late at night, papers spread around her as she wrote to Dr. Thompson, "I think I found a new approach to the third variable constraint." The chalk felt familiar in her hand. For a moment, the packed lecture hall faded away, and she was back in that kitchen, working through the problem step by step, Dr. Thompson's encouraging emails guiding her forward. "Miss Jackson, if you're finding the problem too challenging, you may say so," Professor Harrington said, breaking the silence that had stretched for nearly a minute. Several students shifted uncomfortably. Someone near the back coughed. Without responding, Imani began to write. Her hand moved confidently, muscle memory taking over as she laid out the initial framework just as she had practiced countless times. First, she wrote out the standard approach that most mathematicians had tried, the one that ultimately led to the paradox. From the corner of her eye, she saw Professor Wells lean toward Harrington with a satisfied smile. They thought she was simply copying known work, proving their point that she didn't belong. But then Imani reached the critical juncture, the point where traditional approaches hit a wall. Instead of stopping, she kept writing, introducing a substitution technique she had developed during those late nights. Her chalk scratched steadily across the board as complex symbols filled the space. "What is she doing?" one of the teaching assistants whispered, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "That's not the standard approach." Professor Harrington's smile faded slightly as he watched Imani work through the first board and moved to the second without hesitation. He glanced at Professor Wells, whose smug expression had given way to confusion. "Young lady, where did you learn this approach?" he interrupted, his voice sharper than before. Imani paused, chalk hovering mid-equation. "I worked through it myself," she said quietly, then turned back to continue. "Impossible," muttered Professor Wells. "She must have memorized someone else's work." But as Imani continued to the third board, even this excuse became difficult to believe. She wasn't simply reciting memorized steps, she was explaining her reasoning as she worked, pointing out the innovative connections between variables that allowed her to bypass the traditional roadblocks in the problem. The room had gone completely silent. Even the skeptical professors were watching with undisguised amazement as this first-year student methodically dismantled a problem that had frustrated experts for decades. One of the younger faculty members in the audience, Dr. Rivera from the physics department, leaned forward in his seat, eyes wide. "She's using a tensor transformation approach," he whispered to his colleague. That's brilliant. I've never seen anyone apply it to this problem before." In the student section, phones had appeared as people began recording the unexpected math lesson unfolding before them. Tyler, who had never spoken directly to Imani, was filming every move of her chalk, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. Professor Harrington's face had drained of color. What had been planned as a moment of humiliation was transforming into something else entirely before his eyes. He recognized enough of what Imani was doing to understand that her approach was not only valid but elegantly innovative. As Imani reached a critical step in the proof, she paused, took a deep breath, and turned to face the class. For the first time since arriving at Westfield, she felt truly centered, truly herself. The mathematics flowing through her wasn't just knowledge, it was her voice, finally being heard. "This next step," she said, her voice growing stronger, "is where the traditional approach creates the paradox. But if we view the constraint from a different dimensional perspective." She turned back to the board and continued writing, unaware that her quiet confidence had just changed the course of her life at Westfield forever. The clock on the wall ticked past the 40-minute mark as Imani worked steadily through the problem. What had begun as Professor Harrington's attempt to humiliate her had transformed into a masterclass that no one wanted to interrupt. Students who had never acknowledged her existence now watched with open mouths as her chalk danced across the fourth blackboard. "She's actually solving it," whispered a graduate student to his neighbor. "I've studied this paradox for 2 years and never got this far." Professor Wells had stopped taking notes, her pen frozen mid-air as Imani introduced a mathematical technique that none of the watching professors had considered. The planned humiliation was unraveling with each equation, each elegant turn of mathematical reasoning that Imani presented. Professor Harrington's face had moved through a spectrum of emotions, from smug certainty to confusion, then disbelief, and now something that looked remarkably like fear. His reputation within the department rested largely on his mathematical prowess, and here was a first-year student dismantling a famous problem with approaches he barely understood. "Where did you study these techniques?" he interrupted, his voice sharper than intended. Imani paused, chalk still pressed against the board. "I taught myself," she said simply. "After reading Dr. Thompson's original paper." "Self-taught?" Professor Wells scoffed. "That's hardly possible for mathematics at this level." Imani didn't bother responding. Instead, she continued writing, explaining as she went. "The key insight is recognizing that the paradox only exists if we accept conventional boundaries between these variables. If we reconceptualize the relationship." Her voice was quiet but steady, gaining strength with each word. Several students had pulled out their phones, recording her explanation. Tyler, who sat in the front row, hadn't blinked in minutes. He'd never seen anything like this. A peer working through a problem that had stumped professionals, explaining complex concepts with clarity that made even him understand parts of it. In the back of the room, Dr. Rivera pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to a colleague in the mathematics department. "You need to see this. Keller Thompson, being solved. Right now. Thorn Hall." As Imani worked through the final constraints of the problem, a strange quiet settled over the room. This was no longer about proving who belonged at Westfield. This was about witnessing something remarkable, a genuine breakthrough happening in real time. "And here," Imani said, writing the final equation with a steady hand, "we can see that the paradox resolves when we apply the transformation consistently across all dimensions of the problem." She underlined her conclusion twice and stepped back from the board. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft tapping of rain against the windows. Imani stood alone at the front of the room, surrounded by blackboards filled with her work, waiting for Professor Harrington's response. It was Dr. Rivera who broke the silence. He stood up from his seat and began to applaud. The sound echoed strangely in the quiet room until, one by one, other students joined in. Soon the entire lecture hall filled with the sound of applause, growing louder as students who had never spoken to Imani stood to recognize what they had just witnessed. Professor Harrington remained frozen, his plan in ruins. Professor Wells studied her shoes, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The other faculty members exchanged glances, realizing they had just witnessed something historic, not just a mathematical breakthrough, but the very public failure of academic gatekeeping. "That was unexpected," Professor Harrington finally managed, his voice barely audible over the continued applause. Imani met his eyes directly for the first time. "Mathematics often is," she replied. As the applause finally died down, students began to gather their things, talking excitedly among themselves. The scheduled lecture had been forgotten entirely. No one would remember what was supposed to be taught that day, but everyone would remember what they had learned instead. A young woman named Leah, who had sat across the room from Imani all semester, approached her as she gathered her notes. "That was amazing," she said simply. "Would you maybe want to study together sometime?" Imani smiled, feeling a small crack in the invisible wall that had surrounded her since arriving at Westfield. "I'd like that," she said. As students filed out, many nodding respectfully to Imani as they passed, Professor Harrington remained at his desk, staring at the boards filled with work he would need hours to fully comprehend. His plan to expose a student he deemed unworthy had instead revealed something else entirely, his own prejudice, and a mathematical mind far greater than he had been willing to recognize. By afternoon, videos of Imani solving the Keller-Thompson paradox had spread across campus. Students who had never set foot in the mathematics building watched in fascination as she explained concepts they couldn't understand but could somehow feel the importance of. "Math Girl Destroys Professors" read one post that had already gathered thousands of views beyond Westfield. Imani sat alone in a library, trying to focus on her chemistry homework while ignoring the whispers and glances from nearby tables. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications and friend requests from people who had never acknowledged her existence before today. She turned it face down, unsure how to feel about her sudden visibility. "Is this seat taken?" Imani looked up to see Dr. Rivera, the physics professor who had been the first to applaud her that morning. She shook her head, and he settled into the chair across from her, placing a folder on the table between them. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said quietly, mindful of the library's hush. "I wanted to speak with you about what happened today." Imani's stomach tightened. Despite her triumph, years of experience had taught her that attention from authority figures wasn't always positive. "Your solution was remarkable," Dr. Rivera continued. "I've already sent the recording to several colleagues, including," he paused, watching her reaction carefully, "Dr. Eleanor Thompson herself." Imani's eyes widened. "You know Dr. Thompson?" "We were research partners years ago," he nodded. "And she knows you, apparently. She called me 20 minutes after receiving the video." Heat rushed to Imani's face. Her correspondence with Dr. Thompson had been her most treasured secret, a relationship she had never expected to be revealed like this. "She told me about your letters," Dr. Rivera said, smiling. 3 years of working on this problem together. She said you have one of the most promising mathematical minds she's encountered in decades." In the quiet of the library, Imani finally allowed herself to feel the weight of what had happened. "Professor Harrington didn't just randomly call on me, did he?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Dr. Rivera's expression grew serious. "No. What happened this morning was troubling. The provost has already called an emergency meeting of the Ethics Committee. Professor Harrington and Professor Wells have been asked to provide explanations for their behavior." "I don't want to cause trouble," Imani said quickly. "You didn't cause anything," Dr. Rivera replied firmly. "They did. And in the process, they accidentally revealed an extraordinary talent that might have remained hidden much longer." He pushed the folder toward her. "Dr. Thompson is flying in tomorrow. She wants to meet with you. And to verify your solution for publication." "Publication?" Imani echoed, hardly believing what she was hearing. "The Keller-Thompson paradox has stumped mathematicians for decades. A solution would be significant news in the field. Your name would be on it." As Dr. Rivera explained the possibilities opening before her, Imani noticed activity at the library entrance. Dean Harford, Westfield's silver-haired administrator, was approaching their table with a concerned expression. "Ms. Jackson," the dean said, inclining his head politely, "the university would like to offer its deepest apologies for this morning's incident. We've already begun a full investigation." "I don't want anyone to lose their job," Imani said, surprising herself with her own conviction. The dean looked startled. "That's very generous, considering the circumstances." "What I want," Imani continued, finding her voice growing stronger, "is for this never to happen to another student. Not because they're on scholarship or because of where they come from or what they look like." Dean Hartford nodded slowly. "Perhaps you would consider joining the Student Experience Committee? We clearly need voices like yours." As they discussed the possibilities for institutional change, Imani's phone lit up with a new message. It was from her mother. "Baby, what's going on?" "My phone is blowing up with links to videos of you. Someone from the Chicago Tribune called asking for an interview about my math genius daughter." Imani smiled, realizing she had a lot to explain. The quiet life she had imagined at Westfield, keeping her head down, working hard, and proving herself gradually, had vanished in a single morning. Something new and unexpected was taking its place. Outside the library windows, students gathered in small groups, many watching the viral videos of her solution on their phones. Among them was Leah, who caught Imani's eye through the glass and gave her a thumbs up. For the first time since arriving at Westfield, Imani felt truly seen, not as an outsider or a scholarship case, but as herself. 5 years later, Imani Jackson stood at the podium in Oslo, Norway, the weight of the Fields Medal heavy in her hand. The auditorium was packed with the world's greatest mathematical minds, all standing to applaud her achievement. At 30, she was among the youngest recipients in the medal's history. "Mathematics showed me a path when doors seemed closed," she said into the microphone, her voice steady and clear. "It spoke a truth that couldn't be denied, even by those who refused to see me." In the front row sat her mother, dabbing proud tears with a handkerchief. Beside her was Dr. Eleanor Thompson, now in her 70s, beaming like a proud grandmother. 5 years ago, when Dr. Thompson had flown to Westfield to verify Imani's solution to the paradox, she had done more than confirm a mathematical breakthrough. She had found a kindred spirit. The Jackson solution, as it came to be known in textbooks, had rewritten understanding of theoretical calculus. What had begun as an attempt to humiliate a scholarship student had instead launched one of the most remarkable careers in modern mathematics. From the back of the hall, a tall figure watched with a complex expression. Professor Harrington had not lost his job after the incident, largely because of Imani's insistence that institutional change was more important than individual punishment. Instead, he had been required to undergo extensive bias training and to work directly with the university's diversity initiatives. The experience had transformed him in ways he never expected, forcing him to confront prejudices he had denied even to himself. After her speech, as attendees mingled at the reception, Imani found herself surrounded by young students from around the world, many from backgrounds similar to her own. "How did you keep believing in yourself?" asked a young woman from Nigeria, clutching a well-worn copy of Imani's first published paper. Imani thought back to that rainy Monday at Westfield. "I didn't always believe in myself," she admitted, "but I believed in the math. Numbers don't care where you come from or what you look like. They just want to be understood." Later that evening, Imani slipped away from the celebrations and found a quiet corner to make a video call. On her screen appeared 24 faces, children from her old neighborhood in South Chicago, gathered in the community center she had funded with her research grants. "Did you win, Ms. Jackson?" called out a bright-eyed girl in the front. Imani held up the medal so they could see it. "We won," she corrected gently. "And next summer, all of you will be coming to the math camp at Westfield." The children cheered. The Imani Jackson Foundation, established after her breakthrough, had already sent hundreds of underrepresented students to specialized math programs. More importantly, it had changed how these students saw themselves and their possibilities. The next morning, Imani visited the University of Oslo to give a guest lecture. As she prepared her notes, a news alert appeared on her phone. Professor Wells had announced her retirement from Westfield. The accompanying article mentioned the university's transformed culture and quoted Wells saying, "Today's Westfield is very different from the institution I joined 30 years ago. Change is inevitable." Imani smiled slightly as she put away her phone. Change was indeed inevitable, but rarely easy. The mathematics department at Westfield now boasted the most diverse faculty and student body in its history, a direct result of the scholarship program Imani had helped design during her senior year. As students filed into the lecture hall, Imani noticed a familiar face. Professor Harrington nodded respectfully from the back row. He had emailed weeks earlier asking permission to attend, explaining that he was on sabbatical to study innovative teaching methods. "Today we'll be discussing how mathematical principles can help us understand social systems," Imani began, surveying the eager faces before her. "How structures that seem permanent can be transformed with the right approach." She wrote an equation on the board, not the famous Jackson solution, but something new she was developing. As chalk touched blackboard, she felt the same calm certainty she had experienced that rainy morning at Westfield. Life had taken her on an unexpected journey, but mathematics remained her constant companion, revealing patterns and possibilities that others might miss. The equation began to take shape under her hand, elegant, truthful, and impossible to deny.